was 26 years old, wearing a Bavarian corporal's uniform, and he had never built anything more complicated than a gun carriage. He had no engineering degree, no naval background, no money of his own. What he had was a coastline under blockade, a notebook full of sketches, and an idea that every trained naval architect in Europe would have called impossible. A warship that could vanish underwater, swim beneath an enemy hull, and come back out again with the crew still breathing. He built it anyway. The machine he designed would sink to the bottom of a harbor with him locked inside it, and he would walk away from that disaster having invented something no one had ever done before, escaping a sunken submarine alive. The same lack of money and lack of engine power that let him build his boat at all would also be the reason it kept failing him, again in front of an emperor. His name was Wilhelm Bauer, and decades before Germany, France, or the United States had a working military submarine, a corporal with no formal training already did. Wilhelm Bauer was born in Dillingen, a small town on the Danube in the Kingdom of Bavaria, on December 23, 1822. His father was a sergeant in a Bavarian cavalry regiment, and there was no family fortune, no university line, no path into engineering that ran through class or connections. As a boy, Bauer apprenticed as a wood-turner, a trade of lathes and hand tools, not blueprints and calculus, by every measure that mattered to the military establishments of his time. He was exactly the wrong kind of man to design a warship. He joined the Bavarian army anyway, and rose only as far as corporal, an artillery non-commissioned officer, not an academy-trained officer with a seat at any planning table. Then, in 1848, the First Schleswig War broke out between the German Confederation and Denmark over the Schleswig-Holstein duchies, and Bauer found himself posted to the northern coast, watching the war play out from ground level. What he watched was humiliating. The Danish Navy held near total command of the sea, and its warships sat off the German coastline almost unchallenged, cutting off supply and movement at will. German land forces could win ground battles and still lose the war, because nothing they had could touch a fleet sitting safely offshore. Bauer, watching this from an artillery position with no say in naval strategy, became fixated on a single, stubborn question. What if a warship didn't need to fight the blockade on the surface at all? What if it could go underneath it? It wasn't an entirely new idea. Inventors had floated submersible designs for over a century, going back to Cornelis Drebbel's Rhodes submersible built for the English court in the 1620s. But those had been curiosities, demonstrations, party tricks for royalty. Bauer wasn't interested in a novelty. He wanted a weapon that could dive under a blockading ship, attach a charge to its hull, and slip away before anyone on deck even knew it had been there. He had no formal training to make that leap from idea to object, so he built one the only way available to him. He taught himself. He studied hydraulics. He studied hull design and ship construction from whatever manuals and second-hand knowledge he could gather, working through the physics of buoyancy and pressure largely alone, on his own time, with no institutional backing and no engineering credential to his name. And here is where his defining philosophy took shape, the one idea that would define every boat he ever built, for better and for worse. Germany in 1850 had no compact engine capable of powering a submerged vessel, no batteries strong enough, no combustion engine small enough, nothing that could push a hull through water while sealed underneath it. So Bauer built his design around the only power source he could actually get his hands on: human muscle. Men turning a treadwheel, driving a propeller by hand and foot, exactly like turning a lathe. It was primitive. It was also, crucially, buildable, with materials and labor that existed in 1850, by a corporal with no budget and no institutional support. Muscle power was what let Wilhelm Bauer build a working submarine when properly funded naval engineers hadn't managed it at all. It would also in time be the reason every boat he built eventually failed him. Bauer's plan couldn't stay a sketch forever. Before his studies could mature into anything solid, the war itself began collapsing out from under him. The troops of the German Confederation decided to withdraw from Schleswig-Holstein, handing the duchies back toward Danish control. For most soldiers, that would have ended the matter. Bauer instead walked away from the Bavarian army entirely and joined the Schleswig-Holstein forces directly, choosing an unstable, embattled cause over his own military career, because it was the only place still fighting the war he wanted to solve. This is where the story's real antagonist reveals itself, and it isn't a person. There is no rival engineer standing across a workshop from Wilhelm Bauer, no bureaucrat with a personal grudge, no competing design bureau racing him to a fly-off. His opponent was something harder to fight and impossible to defeat outright. Institutional indifference, repeated in every country he approached for the rest of his life. Bavaria wasn't interested. When he first brought his plan to a Bavarian military commission, they turned him away. Getting a low-ranking corporal's design in front of anyone with money to spend meant fighting an entire chain of command that owed him nothing and had no reason to gamble on an untrained inventor's underwater weapon. He got one break. Werner von Siemens, already building the reputation that would make his name synonymous with German engineering, took an interest in Bauer's proposal and helped him secure a small sum of money to build a scale model. It wasn't a fortune, it was barely enough, but it was enough to prove the underlying physics worked, and that proof of concept was what finally unlocked real funding for a full-sized boat. The catch was the price of that funding. The military authorities backing him remained skeptical the whole way through, and they used the purse strings to force changes on his design, cutting costs wherever they could, regardless of what those cuts meant for the finished machine. Bauer wasn't handed the resources to build the submarine he wanted. He was handed the resources to build the submarine his funders would tolerate, and told to make it work anyway. Construction went to the machine works of Schwefel and Hault in Kiel, under engineer August Hault, a firm that would later grow into one of Germany's major shipbuilders, but was, at this point, simply the yard willing to take on an unproven design from an unproven inventor. The result was the Brandtaucher, fire diver, 28 feet long, weighing roughly 70,000 pounds, with an iron hull shaped for depth rather than speed. Since no engines small enough or powerful enough existed to drive a submerged hull, the Brandtaucher ran entirely on the muscle power principle Bauer had committed to from the start. Two crewmen turning a large treadwheel by hand and foot to drive the propeller, while a third man, the captain, sat at the stern, working the rudder and controls. Bauer designed the attack itself around stealth rather than firepower. The plan called for the boat to approach a blockading warship completely submerged, slide in beneath its hull where no lookout could see it coming, and let the crew reach through a gutta-percha rubber glove sealed into an opening in the hull to fix an electrically triggered mine directly onto the enemy's hull, then retreat to a safe distance before detonating it. On paper, it was elegant, a way to neutralize a warship that a soldier on shore had no other way of touching. In the water, it hadn't been tested yet at all. Every promise Bauer had made to the men funding him, every argument he'd used to drag this project past a military bureaucracy that didn't want it, was about to be tested for the first time, with him and two other men sealed inside the hull. By the winter of 1850, the Brandtaucher sat finished at the Schwefel and Hault yard in Kiel, and for the first time in over 2 centuries of scattered, half-forgotten submersible experiments, a machine existed that was actually built to fight a war, not to entertain a royal court. Cornelis Drebbel's Rhodes submersible had dazzled King Charles III back in the 1620s, and a German engineer named Jakob Chrysostomus Praetorius had built something called the Steinhuder Hecht that supposedly dove in a lake in 1762, but neither of those had been weapons. They had been demonstrations, curiosities, proof that a boat could go under the water and come back up again, nothing more. Bauer's boat was different in purpose from anything that came before it. It was built with a mine, a rubber glove sealed into the hull, and a tactical doctrine behind it. It was meant to kill ships. That distinction mattered enormously to the men funding him, because Schleswig-Holstein's naval situation in 1812 hadn't improved. The duchies were still fighting for their independence, still facing a Danish fleet that could sit off the coast without serious opposition, and still lacking any surface navy capable of matching Denmark ship for ship. A vessel that could approach unseen, submerged, and destroy a blockading warship from underneath, bypassing broadsides, bypassing gun decks, bypassing everything a conventional navy used to defend itself, wasn't just a novelty weapon. It was, on paper, an equalizer. A corporal's underwater boat could theoretically neutralize a warship that had cost incomparably more to build and crew. The tactical concept itself was commonly inventive for its time. Rather than trying to out-armor or outgun an enemy ship, Bauer designed an attack built entirely around not being seen at all. The Brandtaucher would submerge well clear of its target, close the distance underwater, where no lookout on deck could spot it, and slide directly beneath the enemy's hull. Once positioned, the crewman at the bow would reach through the gutta-percha glove fitted into an opening in the hull, grip the mine mounted within arm's reach on the submarine's exterior, and fix it to the enemy ship's hull by hand, all without breaking the surface. The boat would then back away to a safe distance before the charge was triggered electrically from inside. No ship of that era carried any real defense against an attack that came from directly underneath it. In the dark, with no warning at all. Everything about the boat had been built around this single premise, including its awkward, unglamorous propulsion. There was no engine on Earth in 1850, small enough and self-contained enough to drive a sealed hull underwater. So two crewmen turning a treadwheel by hand and foot were, quite literally, the power plant, driving the propeller shaft through pure physical effort, stroke after stroke, for as long as the mission required. It was slow, it was exhausting. It also required no fuel, no combustion, no supply chain, and no technology that didn't already exist in a Kiel machine shop, which is precisely why a corporal with almost no budget had been able to build it at all, while better-funded naval engineers elsewhere had nothing to show for their own submarine ambitions. By late January of 1851, the Brandtaucher was ready for its first real test in open water, and everyone involved understood what was riding on it. This wasn't a private trial tucked away from view. It was staged as a public demonstration in the harbor at Kiel, in front of officials and onlookers, who had every reason to be skeptical of an unproven design forced through cost-cutting changes by the very authorities now watching it. If the boat performed as promised, Bauer would have delivered something no properly funded, academically trained naval engineer in Europe had yet managed: a working military submarine, ready to be built in greater numbers and turned loose against the blockade that had humiliated German forces since the war began. Bauer himself would be inside the hull for the dive, alongside two other men, a carpenter named Friedrich Witt and a blacksmith named Wilhelm Thomson. Neither of them was a trained submariner, because there was no such thing yet. Nobody alive had ever been one. What they were about to do, take a sealed iron hull down into open water on nothing but muscle power and Bauer's calculations, had, as far as anyone in Kiel that day knew, never actually been done by a purpose-built military submarine before, anywhere, by anyone. February 1st, 1851 arrived, and the harbor was watching. The demonstration that Kiel Harbor was about to watch had been built on the same premise that had made the Brandtaucher possible in the first place, and that premise carried a cost nobody wanted to say out loud until it was too late to fix. Every choice that let Wilhelm Bauer succeed where properly funded engineers hadn't even come close was, at its core, a choice to save weight, save cost, and save complexity. Muscle power, instead of an engine, meant no need for fuel, no combustion system, no supply chain. But it also meant the hull had to be light enough for two men on a treadwheel to physically drive it through the water at any usable speed. A heavier, thicker-walled hull, the kind that could comfortably shrug off deep water pressure, would have been too much dead weight for human legs and arms to move. So the design had to stay lean. The same logic that made the boat buildable at all also set a hard ceiling on how strong it could ever be. That ceiling was made worse before the Brandtaucher ever touched water. The military authorities backing the project had approved funding only on the condition that Bauer cut costs wherever the design allowed it, and those cuts landed exactly where they hurt most: in the materials and construction of the hull itself. Bauer wasn't handed a blank check to build the strongest submarine his physics allowed. He was handed a fraction of what he needed, and told to make a warship out of it anyway. The iron plating that went into the finished Brandtaucher was thinner, and the tolerances tighter, than any engineer would have chosen if depth survival had been the only concern. It hadn't been. Cost had been the concern, and depth survival had been negotiated downward to fit a budget set by men who weren't the ones going into the water. This is where the story's real enemy shows itself plainly. And it isn't a rival inventor or a competing design. Nothing else built anywhere in Europe in 1850 was chasing Bauer in a race to the same harbor. The threat closing in on the Brandtaucher wasn't a competitor's machine. It was physics itself, arriving on schedule. The moment the boat went below the shallow depths, its cost-cut hull had actually been built to survive. Water pressure increases relentlessly and indifferently with depth, and it does not negotiate with a funding shortfall. A hull thin enough for 2 men to power by hand was also a hull thin enough to begin failing at a depth well within what any battlefield submarine would eventually need to reach. Bauer knew, at least in principle, that this tension existed. What he didn't have, what nobody funding him had given him the money or the time to properly test, was hard, verified knowledge of exactly where that failure point sat, or how the finished cost-reduced hull would actually behave once real harbor bottom pressure closed in around it. A model boat proves a concept works. It does not prove a full-sized hull, built under budget constraints its designer didn't fully control, will hold at the depths a real mission would require. There is no political villain to name here in the way later. Engineering stories get to name one. No single minister who understood the danger and buried it anyway for personal gain. The interference that mattered was quieter and more mundane. A military bureaucracy that approved just enough money to get a demonstration built, and not enough to get it built safely, because the men signing off on the budget were managing risk to their treasury, not risk to the 3 men who would actually be sealed inside the hull. That is a kind of political interference too, the kind that doesn't announce itself as sabotage, and rarely gets treated as the cause of what happens next, even when it plainly was. By the last days of January 1851, none of this had been resolved. It had simply been carried, unspoken, into the harbor at Kiel, packed into a hull that looked finished and ready from the outside and had never once been tested at the depth the demonstration was about to require. The same design choice that had made Wilhelm Bauer's submarine possible in the first place. Light, cheap, muscle-driven, built to a budget instead of to a margin of safety, was now the exact same design choice that was about to be tested against open water, in public, with Bauer and 2 other men locked inside it. February 1, 1851, opened cold and clear over Kiel Harbor, and by mid-morning a small crowd of officials, officers, and onlookers had gathered along the waterfront to watch what Wilhelm Bauer had spent nearly 3 years fighting to build. This was not a private trial tucked away from prying eyes. It was a public demonstration, staged in front of the very authorities who had funded the Brandtaucher on the condition that its costs stay low. The men who would now see in front of witnesses whether their money had bought them a working weapon or an expensive failure. Bauer climbed down into the hull first, followed by carpenter Friedrich Witt and blacksmith Wilhelm Thompson. Neither man had any real training for what they were about to do, because there was no training that existed yet for it. Bauer took his position at the stern, working on the rudder and controls. Witt and Thompson took the treadwheel, the 2 of them driving the propeller by hand and foot, exactly as the design called for. The hatch was sealed. 28 feet of iron hull. 70,000 pounds of it, cut to a budget instead of a safety margin, now held 3 men and nothing else between them and the water outside. The first minutes went smoothly. The Brandtaucher answered its controls, held its trim, and began the controlled descent Bauer had planned, down toward the deeper water of the harbor, the demonstration proceeding exactly as promised to the officials watching from shore. For a few minutes, it must have looked like vindication. A corporal with no engineering degree, no naval background, and almost no money of his own had built a machine that no properly funded naval engineer in Europe had yet managed to put in the water. It was working. Then it wasn't. As the boat reached the deepest part of the harbor, the pressure of the surrounding water found exactly the weakness that had been built into the hull months earlier, back when funding had been cut and cheaper materials substituted in its place. The iron plating, thinner than it should have been, began to give. Seams that had never been tested at this depth started to leak. Water began forcing its way into the hull. Not in a sudden catastrophic rupture, but in the slow, spreading, unstoppable way that tells three men trapped inside an iron shell that the machine around them is failing in real time, and there is no way to reverse it from where they're sitting. The Brandtaucher began to flood. As it took on water, it lost the buoyancy that had been keeping it under control, and it settled, uncontrolled, to the bottom of Kiel Harbor, roughly 50 feet down, by later accounts. Bauer, Witt, and Thompson were no longer conducting a demonstration. They were sealed inside a sinking iron coffin, on the floor of a public harbor, with water still leaking in around them, and no way to reach the surface until the pressure equation resolved itself on its own terms. This is where Bauer's design, for all its flaws, gave him something no one had planned for and no one had tested, a way out that existed only because the disaster was happening slowly enough to think through. Bauer understood, from the hydraulics he had taught himself years earlier, that the hatch could not be forced open against the outside water pressure, not while the air pressure inside the hull remained at the surface level it had been sealed at. But if enough water was allowed to keep entering, the air trapped inside the hull would compress, and its pressure would rise to match the crushing pressure of the water outside. At the exact moment those two pressures equalized, the hatch would open freely, because there would no longer be a pressure difference holding it shut. The math was sound. Living through it was another matter entirely. It meant deliberately not fighting the flooding, letting the harbor keep pouring in around them, in the dark, inside a hull that had already failed once, with no way to know exactly how long the wait would take, or whether the boat itself would hold together long enough for them to survive it. Bauer had to keep Witt and Thompson from panicking through all of it, sealed in near total darkness at the bottom of a harbor, listening to water rise around their feet by design rather than accident, trusting a plan that had never been tried by anyone, anywhere, because no one had ever needed to try it before. Hour after hour passed. Some accounts put the wait at roughly 6 hours. Others describe it stretching closer to 7.5. Whatever the exact count, it was long enough that word reached the shore that the Brandtaucher had gone down and not come back up, and long enough that, by some accounts, a memorial service for the three men began being arranged on shore while they were still alive and waiting in the dark beneath the harbor. Finally, the pressure inside the flooded hull rose to match the water pressure outside. The hatch, which minutes earlier would have been impossible to force open, now gave way freely. Bauer, Witt, and Thompson swam up out of the wreck and broke the surface of Kiel Harbor alive. Three men climbing out of a submarine that had just sunk beneath them, having survived the first submarine sinking in history by using physics no one had ever had reason to test before that morning. It was, by any technical measure, a failure. The Brandtaucher itself never surfaced under its own power that day. It sat, disabled, on the harbor floor. But Wilhelm Bauer had just done something that mattered every bit as much as a successful demonstration would have. He had proven that a man could survive being trapped inside a sunken submarine, using a solution he had worked out entirely on his own, with no precedent to draw from, and no one to test it before he needed it himself. The applause Bauer might have earned for surviving never translated into support for building again. Schleswig-Holstein's government, watching its investment site disabled on the harbor floor in front of witnesses, had exactly the reaction the kind of public failure invites from men managing a treasury. They cut him off. The boat that had just proven a man could survive a submarine sinking was, to the officials who funded it, simply a submarine that had sunk. There would be no second Schleswig-Holstein boat, no further money, no institutional patience left for an inventor whose only finished product now sat underwater in Kiel Harbor. Bauer left Schleswig-Holstein and did the only thing left available to him. He took the idea on the road. Over the next several years he carried his submarine concept to Austria-Hungary, to Britain, and to France, presenting the same case each time, that a working submarine was not a theoretical curiosity, but a demonstrated, if imperfect, reality, and that he was the one man in Europe who had actually built and tested one. Each time the answer was some version of no. None of the naval establishments he approached were willing to gamble serious money on an inventor with a low military rank, no formal engineering credential, and a very public sinking as his only completed project. The rejection wasn't personal, It was the same institutional caution that had shaped every step of his career so far, simply repeating itself in new capitals with new officials. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected direction. In 1855, Bauer secured the backing of Grand Duke Constantine of Russia, and with it, a contract to build a second submarine in St. Petersburg. This time, the design was substantially larger and more ambitious than the Brandtaucher had been, called the Sea Teufel, Sea Devil, and known in some records as Le Diable Marin. The new boat stretched to roughly 51 feet, more than twice the length of its predecessor, built with a thicker iron hull, and carrying a crew of 11 to 15 men depending on the account, several of whom worked a treadmill driving the propeller in place of the Brandtaucher's smaller wheel. Having learned directly from the near disaster at Kiel, Bauer built in a genuine safety innovation this time. A diver's chamber, functioning like an airlock, that let crew members leave and re-enter the submerged hull without flooding the entire vessel. A direct engineering answer to exactly the kind of emergency that had trapped him and his crew 4 years earlier. Testing moved to Kronstadt, the fortress naval base guarding the approach to St. Petersburg, in the spring of 1856. And this time, the results were nothing like Kiel. The Sea Teufel performed. Dive after dive went according to plan, with no repeat of the flooding and near catastrophe that had defined the Brandtaucher's only real test. The boat completed 133 successful dives at Kronstadt. Proof, finally, of a submarine design that could be trusted to work as intended, not merely survive when it didn't. One of those dives became something closer to theater than engineering trial. On September 6, 1856, in honor of the coronation of Tsar Alexander II, Bauer staged a dive at Kronstadt during which a small band aboard the submerged Sea Teufel played the Russian national anthem while the boat sat underwater, the sound reportedly carrying to the surface. An underwater performance for an emperor's coronation, delivered by a Bavarian corporal's submarine that no navy in Western Europe had been willing to fund. It was the high point of Bauer's public career, the moment his machine wasn't merely surviving a demonstration, it was being trusted with a ceremonial role in the coronation of one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Then, on the 134th dive, the Sea Teufel got stuck on the harbor floor. Accounts differ on the exact cause. Most point to an operating error, rather than a structural failure of the kind that had doomed the Brandtaucher. This time, the crew was rescued, and the boat itself was eventually lifted back out of the water, without the drawn-out, near-fatal ordeal Bauer and his men had endured at Kiel. But the damage to Bauer's standing was done regardless. Conservative officers within the Russian Navy, who had likely tolerated the submarine project as a novelty backed by a Grand Duke rather than embraced it as serious naval doctrine, used the incident as confirmation of exactly the skepticism they had held about underwater warships all along. The support Bauer needed to keep building in Russia dried up. By 1858, unable to secure further sponsors there, he left the country. 3 outcomes closed this chapter of Bauer's life, and none of them were the triumphant ending the Kronstadt coronation dive might have suggested was coming. Bauer himself left Russia with his reputation intact as an inventor, but with no permanent institutional home for his work, still chasing sponsors, still one design ahead of any navy willing to commit to him long-term. His crews, at Kiel and at Kronstadt alike, survived both of his submarines' failures, a genuinely remarkable safety record for 2 vessels built at the very edge of what 1850s engineering could achieve, powered entirely by the men inside them. And the boats themselves, the actual hardware, ended their careers without ever being adopted into standing naval service anywhere. The Brandtaucher abandoned on the floor of Kiel Harbor, the Sea Teufel's ultimate fate after its recovery largely unrecorded. 2 of the most advanced submarines in the world, in their moment, and neither one ever fired the weapon it had been designed to deliver, or sailed under a nation's flag as a commissioned warship. Leaving Russia in 1858 did not mean leaving engineering. Bauer briefly re-entered Prussian service, but nothing about his standing had fundamentally changed. He was still an inventor without a permanent institutional home, still valued more for individual feats of ingenuity than trusted with sustained naval investment. What followed was a quieter, more scattered final chapter, built less around submarines and more around the general engineering problems the sea kept putting in front of him. His most celebrated achievement in these years wasn't a new submarine at all. It was a salvage job. Bauer developed and patented a method for raising sunken vessels from the seabed, and used it to lift a warship known as the Ludwig that had gone down and been written off as lost. It was, in its own way, a continuation of everything that had defined his career from the start, solving a problem that trained naval engineers hadn't cracked, using resourcefulness rather than institutional backing, and doing it well enough that even skeptical authorities had to take notice. The Tsar had gone so far as to appoint him Imperial Submarine Engineer specifically to carry out this kind of salvage work, recognition of a sort, though it came for raising ships rather than for the submarines he'd actually built to sink them. He kept experimenting elsewhere too. Back home in Bavaria, Bauer conducted underwater shooting trials at Lake Starnberg, testing how firearms and explosives behaved beneath the surface, research with no immediate naval application, but consistent with a mind that never stopped treating the underwater world as an engineering problem still half solved. He also worked on devices for laying cable underwater, another quiet, practical extension of the hydraulics and pressure knowledge he had taught himself, alone, back when he was still a corporal sketching an impossible boat in his own notebook. None of this brought him back to the center of naval engineering. It kept him working, on his own terms, in the margins of a field that had never fully let him in. Health problems began overtaking him by the late 1860s. In 1869, ill health forced Bauer into retirement in Munich, ending, for good, the decades of self-funded experimentation and sponsor chasing that had defined his adult life. He died there on June 20, 1875, at the age of 52, a man who had built two of the most advanced submarines in the world in his lifetime, and who died without ever having one adopted into standing service by any navy that funded him. The Brandtaucher itself outlasted him by staying exactly where it had sunk. It sat on the floor of Kiel Harbor for 36 years after that February morning in 1851. Not the 80 years popular retellings sometimes claim, but 36. A gap long enough that an entire generation had grown up and gone to sea in vessels Bauer's design had never gotten the chance to influence. It was finally recovered in 1887, and today it holds a genuine, verifiable title, the oldest surviving submarine in the world. It's on permanent display at the Bundeswehr Military History Museum in Dresden, still intact enough that visitors can see exactly the shape of the machine. 3 men nearly died inside, and exactly the hull that a funding shortfall had made too thin for the depth it was asked to survive. The historical verdict on Wilhelm Bauer has settled into something fairly consistent among naval historians. The engineering instinct was real, and the timing was, in the truest sense, ahead of its era, but the institutional world he needed in order to turn that instinct into a lasting weapons program simply never arrived for him. Germany itself wouldn't field a serious combat submarine fleet until the U-boats of the First World War, more than 6 decades after Bauer's corporal-built Brandtaucher first went into Kiel Harbor. The country that eventually became synonymous with submarine warfare had, at its very origin, an unfunded, self-taught inventor that no one in power had been willing to back for long. That verdict outlived him in a more literal way, too. In the mid-20th century, the German Navy commissioned a Type W-21 U-boat, among the most advanced submarine designs to come out of the Second World War, and named it Wilhelm Bauer. That boat, originally designated U-2540, was scuttled at the war's end without ever going on patrol, then raised from the seabed in 1957. Refurbished, and recommissioned for West Germany's post-war Navy. It later served for decades as a test platform for new submarine technology, before finally becoming a museum ship in Bremerhaven in 1984. A fitting, almost uncanny repetition of Bauer's own life. A submarine bearing his name, sunk and then salvaged, ending its career not as a weapon that ever fired a shot, but as an object placed on display for the public to study. Exactly like the Brandtaucher itself, sitting in a museum 4 hours away in Dresden. Every submarine that came after Wilhelm Bauer would eventually solve the problem he never got the chance to solve himself. Engines replaced muscle, steel replaced funding shortfall iron. Navies with standing budgets and standing patience replaced Grand Dukes and skeptical ministries. who backed an inventor only as far as the next demonstration. But none of that later engineering happened in a vacuum. It happened because a corporal with no money and no formal training had already proven, twice, decades early, that a sealed hull could go under the water on purpose, and its crew could come back out alive. There are two philosophies sitting at the heart of this story, and they never resolved into one. The first belonged to Wilhelm Bauer. Build with what you actually have. Prove the idea works even if the materials are wrong, and trust that a good enough concept will eventually find the resources it deserves. The second belonged to every Navy he ever approached. Don't fund what you can't verify, and don't gamble Treasury money on an untrained man's underwater weapon, no matter how many times he's already proven the physics. Neither philosophy was foolish. Bauer's got a submarine built and tested when nobody else has had. The Navy's caution meant not one of them ever had to explain a lost warship, a drowned crew, or a wasted fortune sunk into an amateur's design that failed for good. Both were rational. Both were also, in their own way, exactly what kept Bauer's submarines from becoming Germany's submarines, or Russia's submarines. For another 60 years, he never got the resources to fix what funding cuts had broken in the Brandtaucher's hull. He never got the standing naval program that the Seeteufel's 133 successful dives at Kronstadt should have earned him. What he got instead was a title no one could take away after the fact. The man who built the machine, twice, when the men who could have paid for it properly chose not to. Go back to that corporal standing on the Schleswig coast in 1848, watching a foreign fleet sit unbothered offshore, while German soldiers won ground battles that didn't matter, because nothing they had could touch a ship. He had no engineering degree, no naval background, no money of his own, and he built the thing anyway, using nothing but hand tools, self-taught hydraulics, and men turning a wheel by hand and foot. He sank once, in front of witnesses, and figured out how to survive it live, with no one having ever done it before. He built again, in a country not his own, and had his machine play a national anthem underwater for the coronation of a czar. And when the support ran out both times, he did not get a museum-quality submarine of his own to show for it while he was alive to see it. The Brandtaucher sat at the bottom of Kiel Harbor for 36 years, forgotten exactly the way its inventor was forgotten by every institution that had turned him away. When it finally came up in 1887, it came up whole enough to still tell its own story. The world's oldest surviving submarine, sitting today in a museum in Dresden, 4 hours from a second museum in Bremerhaven, where a very different, much more advanced submarine now carries his name. He was a corporal. He had never built anything more complicated than a gun carriage. He built a submarine anyway, and it outlived every navy that refused to believe in it.